Well, first I want to thank you, Adam. That was a great presentation. It's going to be very useful with some of the people that I'm organizing with actually right now. When this whole crisis started, I realized that when things started to close, shelter in place, I realized that I was linked to a lot of people who were going to be going through some of these problems, losing their jobs, losing housing, not knowing what to do about not being able to pay rent. And I just put out a call to have a meeting, and we started to meet and discuss what we could do about it. And I think that it really speaks to what you were talking about recognizing that the system, the people in power right now are not making many moves to alleviate the problem. And not only, you talked about the expanding power of rent strikes, but what we discovered was not only did we have expanding power if we organized a lot of people to not pay rent, but even just in little ways, starting to meet, talk to each other, having a group of 10 people weigh in on your problem, trying to figure out what you're going to do about potentially losing your housing, just meant that we had more voices who could pick up information, share it with each other, and find different ways to sort of organize and leverage power in those different situations. So I think I just wanted to put that out there to people to think about in this period. A lot of people are getting into motion, and we don't have to just think big. I had other friends who were like, yeah, I'm on rent strike, and they just put that out there, but then there was no real base behind it. They didn't have links to the other people around them in their community, and didn't see all of these little ways that we could start to come together and create networks that meant that on the ground we had more power. And when the Black Lives Matter stuff started, we quickly had a group that wanted to sit and meet and discuss racism in our society and politics and what protests to go to. So yeah, I just want to put that out there to people, the idea of in these little ways you can start to organize and connect with each other.
I really digest information, and I want to thank Adam for the way information was presented today. And I want to try to synthesize and kind of just put out some basics that people can't pay rent, people have nowhere to live, and the most important point that I would like to make is that landlords are getting hostile. Landlords are doing things like, hostile eviction, where they're not waiting for the courts. They're not waiting for the sheriff or something to come to your door. They're, not fixing things. They're actually, knocking on the door and saying it's time for you to leave. There's women with, kids in the living room and nowhere to go. And I think that what it looks like on the ground, I would like to address is that, the buildings, when you talk about apartment buildings, withholding rent and that type of thing. But if you think about a woman who's on Section 8, or you think about, somebody who's, living in a trailer on some land that they've been paying really cheap rent to live in, and the landlord's like, done, no more garbage, pick up, no more, that things are, thank you, Riley, things are, getting to a point where we need to physically support each other and talking to these landlords and showing up for each other. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to I had 2 points. I think it's important to realize there's all this discussion about, quote unquote, reopening the economy. And I think that we have to understand that, the idea of reopening the economy is also reopening the right of landlords to start evicting people and to start going after people. And we have to understand that just like it's giving people the right, with workers going back to work, and get sick and die or be exploited. So I think we need to understand that. And then the second thing I wanted to say is I think that we have to kind of look back to our history and learn from past examples where people have organized tenants unions and ways to fight evictions. A big example of that was during the Great Depression, where in a lot of the major cities in the United States, there were massive tenants units that organized in communities to resist this process. The cops would come evict people, whole neighborhoods would show up and immediately put all the furniture back in the homes, that cops had just taken out. So this idea of what I was talking about, that was built by people starting to organize where they're at, beginning to talk to the people that live in the same building with them in their neighborhood, and realizing a common interest, and then stepping forward to really fight this process. So it's been done in the past, and the only way we're going to fight it is if we, link up with one another and resist the process.
I also had a question. I remember a few speakers back, I don't remember his name, was talking about how rent strikes are a really great idea, but they probably don't actually mean anything unless the people that are withholding their money are from like big investment companies versus like a mom and pop landlord. Like my situation is just, the person that I pay rent to probably owns maybe 2 or 3 other properties and not big multi-unit complexes. So I was just curious to hear about your opinion about that. And, as people that are activists and want to be in solidarity with other people, I kind of wonder how to move about that on a personal level, but also like, I think I hear everyone speaking about like creating networks with our neighbors, which I think is a great idea. So if there is, a block of people to withhold rent, that's great, but they all don't share the same landlord. So any thoughts about that?
I guess I have a comment and perhaps a question for you, Adam, if you want to talk further about this. I think that you did a really good job at connecting so many of the issues that people are facing right now, that have basically just shown all of the contradictions of capitalism. It's making it so people simply cannot hide from the problems that this economic system has created. One of them being the coronavirus pandemic, the lack of resources that were given to people to protect themselves in relation to healthcare, access to healthcare, also the economic crisis, the mass unemployment that we're facing right now, and the fact that the system, like you said, has not used the resources that it obviously has in a way that protects people's lives. And then we have the situation right now with the confrontation of this, racism of the society that has been happening for so long in relationship with the police. And I think you mentioned it, and I just would like to expand on this because they're connected and they're so important, is the idea of the way that this society has created this institutionalized racism that creates this extreme poverty on which people live right now based on housing. You mentioned that wealth is really stored in housing, and that's the way that you really have wealth as a family, as a group of people, and that is not something that the Black and brown population have. So I think that that's something that we want to talk about a little bit more, and just explain how that has created this problem where you have Black and brown people that are falling into debt very quickly because they don't have this storage of wealth to count on. So if one member of the family ends up in a critical economic situation, they don't have that to count on. So if you could talk about that a little bit more, I would appreciate it.
This is lots of really, really good questions, and I will do my best to talk about at least some of them, and happy to be pushed more and to be, if I don't talk about something, bring it back up again. So I think one thing is to recognize that, the injustice that we see in housing is just one part of the broader system, right? So we're not going to be able to solve the housing crisis without solving the broader problem. We aren't going to be able to have housing be a guarantee for everyone until we overthrow capitalism. I mean, it's just not going to happen, right? And there are ways that I think, because the housing system helps prop up the broader system, if we are intentional in how we go about both organizing and the goals that we have in our organizing and mobilizing, we can weaken the foundations. So now that was kind of a broad question. We can maybe, one of the questions in the chat was, or what broad comment, one of the questions in the chat was, you know, we've seen the amount that people are paying in their rent of their income to rent is much, much higher today than it was in the 1970s, right? And that just shows that in the past 50 years, this problem has been magnified as income inequality has been magnified in this country, right? There was a slide that I had that I took out, but that shows that from the 1940s to the 1970s, income for working people about doubled, and the income for the most affluent increased by about 60%. From 1970 up until today, the income for the most affluent has increased by 6 times, while the income for the working class has stagnated, right? And so people's incomes aren't keeping up with the rising cost of housing. It's also the case that we have systematically disinvested in what had been a public housing system, right? The problem in the United States is not that we have too much public housing. The problem in the United States is that we don't have enough of it. And that housing that is publicly owned has been only for people who are very poor. If you look at the city of Vienna as an example, 60% of all of the housing in Vienna is public housing. 60% of all of the housing in Vienna is public housing. Now, if we had a housing sector, a public housing sector like that in the United States, that wouldn't solve every problem, but that would weaken, I think, some of the foundations pretty substantially. Okay, that was one question. Another question was about how systemic racism has sort of played into this, right? And there have been so many tools in policy and in practice that have entrenched racialized power, racist power through our housing system. And then that has been magnified into our transportation system and education system and health system and everything, right? So from racially restrictive covenants, you know, that said you cannot sell your house in this neighborhood to people who are Black, for example. That was, Baltimore City was a pioneer in racist housing practices. Things like redlining, things like blockbusting, where the realtors would say to when a white family put their house up, they would say to white folk, hey, you see who's moving into this neighborhood? Black folk are. You probably want to move out, don't you? And so they would get the white folks to sell their houses cheaper. And then they would go to Black households and say, don't you want to live in this nice neighborhood? And they would jack up the price, right? So they were screwing both the working class white folk and the working class Black folks so that they could put money in their pockets, right? This is the sort of thing that we've seen over and over and over. And, you know, it's something that we can talk about how we end that. I think one of the things, like, we need to build collective power, right? Solidarity is going to be so important. So when hostile landlords try to put people out, we need to be able to intervene, and it can't just be, you know, 1 or 2 people probably intervening. It probably needs to be a collective, right? Because the state has power, and the people who own stuff, the state does their bidding, right? So we need to organize so that we can resist that power in various ways. All right, I'm going to stop for a moment, and please keep asking questions in the chat or wherever else, and I'll come back if I've forgotten things. Sorry if I've missed them.
The trouble with your presentation, Adam, is that it said everything I usually say. I am a deep communist, and most often when I join these things, people forget to go over to concern for the system we live in. I say it is not a contradictory system, or it doesn't have contradictions per se. It has contradictions for your and my getting along, but it works, as it were, for our owners, except, of course, for the Marxian study saying it's going to fall apart because it has its own falling apart built into it. But they keep shoring it up, and that's one of the frightening things. And of course, they shore it up by killing us if we get in the way of stopping their continuation of what they're doing. The people who are doing tenants' rights keep calling, and this is in Berkeley where I live. Keep, you know, the primary rent control originator kind of thing. They call for affordable housing. They're working for affordable housing. Well, that's bullshit. There is no such thing. Rent is a way of torturing us, of controlling us. So we need to get people to decolonize. One of the basic places people to decolonize from is school. School is not a nice place. I mean, a lot of people, you have, what do you call it, chosen memories of what happened, because it's too painful to go over how really painful it was to get through school, even if you were doing a good job in it. People say, oh, I love school. No, you didn't. You accept.
In rent, is there a way that, you know, we can specifically address, I don't know, government, you know, people who work on this stuff? Is this a subject that can be opened to be talked about more? I know that, you know, there's a lot of talk these days about maybe some deflationary ideas of our economy. We can work that. I know unions, it's my understanding, unions traditionally always work towards how things can work towards inflationary ideas to help their practices. So this goes maybe against some of that, but I'm hoping, I'm much in favor of deflationary ideas. So ways to bring down rents, really a really important subject to me. How this can be talked about more everyday conversation with people. I hope maybe you can talk about that a bit. And then my other question: how can we talk about the CARES Act and the HEROES Act in California? At least I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, more openly, because I think if owners really understand it, I think they would totally relax in how they are totally harassing tenants at this time. And, you know, there is a certain tenants are saying, well, we got the HEROES Act and the CARES Act, so, you know, just wait. And how can we better convince owners that they don't have to panic so much and force tenants into really bad compromised positions with what is possible with the CARES Act? And how can we really make the CARES Act, you know, blossom and all that stuff?
You know, everything that we've been talking about today has really been on my mind a lot lately. You know, on top of everything else going on in the world, I just recently graduated from a bachelor's program and have been thinking about, you know, getting a job and a place to live, entering the next stage in my life. But, you know, the reality of the matter is there's rising unemployment, another recession on the horizon, a virus that's threatening life on Earth, the continued deadly violence from police, and, you know, the daily pressure of knowing that climate change is going to make this planet a wasteland if we don't do something about it fast. I and I'm sure everyone else here really can't go on as if these things aren't happening. It's clear to me that the ruling class really cares nothing for our lives, and that it's up to us to change society. They aren't really concerned about the pandemic, not concerned about unemployment numbers, murders by police, or the threat of climate change. Really, all that matters to the ruling class and politicians that run today's society is the bottom line, and how much wealth that they can get out of this planet and every living creature on it. If living through this pandemic and, you know, seeing the resurgence of Black Lives Matter movements globally has shown us anything, it's really that we can only depend on each other to change the way this world works.
The one thing I just wanted to recount was having the benefit of being somewhat old. I remember the statistics of the 70s and the 80s in real time. And having gone through a very, I guess, blessed childhood in a lower middle class town in the suburbs here in California, I grew up with a child of every race in my kindergarten, and I somehow assumed that's the way the world was supposed to work. And then by 7th or 8th grade, we started learning mathematics and percentages, and all of a sudden in the public school, they taught us about real estate, how a man can buy one house and charge twice as much to get it, or buy 10 houses and charge twice as much to make 20% more, you know, to get it. And then they taught us about credit. And everything else I'd learned about simple piggy bank economics, you save, you spend, the person who saves the most is the richest, was turned upside down by all this percentages and speculation. I thought, wait a minute, why are they teaching this immoral stuff in school? Deep in my gut, I just had this feeling that credit cards and real estate were really illegal businesses. And how could they go on? But, you know, 30, 40 years of conditioning, I've given up those feelings until now. And so that's basically the comment I wanted to make. I hope it speaks to the activism we're feeling. I hope everybody else still has that deep gut feeling that we know that when you turn these businesses upside down for nothing but profit, what started out as good becomes wrong. If we can figure that dividing line, like you say, and collectively act on that, it kind of gets down to the basics. So I hope that makes sense.
The last comment is really important, right? Like, we've been told so many stories, and it's clear when we look at the world that the stories are just false, right? I mean, it's just not the way that the world works. And this, sort of gets at something that I think Norma was saying, and then Anne was saying, and that is, like, the system, as I heard Norma, right? The system isn't broken. The policies aren't failed, right? We sometimes use that language, right? When I teach policy classes, sometimes I myself even fall into that, narrative, even though I know better. They aren't failed policies. The system isn't broken. It's working just as it's supposed to, for exactly the people's interests that it is supposed to work, right? And as Anne said, yeah, the ruling class doesn't care about us. They don't care about our interests. And the reason for that is that their interests are not ours. We have very different interests. In fact, opposed interest to them, right? So I think that's at the bottom of all of this that we have to understand. So I want to get back to a comment that, or a question that Soph had asked. This is the case that, I live in a house, and this may not be exactly, Soph, your situation, but I'm suggesting a problem, right? So I live in a unit, I live in a house, and it's one of only a couple that are owned by a very small landlord, right? So that very small landlord probably has more in common with us than with the others, right? With the ruling class, right? So one thing is that, on the very sort of micro level, I think it depends what we do, right? It may be that in the case of one landlord or another landlord, you can talk with them, you can say, boy, I'm having a hard time. This is, what's going on. Can we find some way to work it out? That might be the case. I've worked in housing in Baltimore, and there have been landlords that are, relatively decent people that I've been able to help folks negotiate with. When we get down to it, though, the whole system is the problem, right? So what needs to be overturned isn't, the fact that this, small landlord has, an apartment above, where they live. What has to happen is we have to socialize our housing system. I mean, that's what needs to happen. Our housing system needs to be socialized. And that isn't going to happen unless we socialize everything, right? We can take steps. I do think that there are steps that can be taken that will weaken the systems and structure. Again, I think that community land trusts are a way that we can take housing out of the speculative market, that we can have more democratic control. We need to scale in a way that I haven't seen community land trusts be able to do. We need to develop a much more robust public housing system. And part of that's going to take changing law if we want to do that, because the Clinton administration made it illegal to build any new public housing buildings. In 1997, the Clinton administration, after working with Newt Gingrich and the Republican Congress to destroy the safety net for poor families, which is why we've seen a rise in family homelessness in the subsequent decades, he made it illegal, or he signed a bill that made it illegal to build any new additional public housing, right? So there are big things that need to be addressed. I think that one thing we need to try to do is to try to build that solidarity, right? Without solidarity, without organizing, we're not going to be able to fight back. And that solidarity we might be able to build with some of the small landlords. Depends on whether that landlord goes to throw you out, especially in a more difficult time than usual. Yeah, if you're going to get thrown out by the small landlord, I think you fight back. Other folks, other questions, other thoughts, people that think that I'm totally wrong about this stuff. I'm very happy to learn from other people, especially when they disagree with me.
Hi, thanks Adam for that interesting presentation. Very sobering statistics, but I feel like I learned a lot from it. Just a little bit about myself. I actually teach here in the East Bay, and homelessness, chronic homelessness, was a severe problem for many of the students in our classrooms here. And you factor in the fact that there's multi-generational families. You have students living in elementary, maybe sharing a room with a toddler sibling, and then someone else in high school, and maybe that same high school student actually has to go to work. And so just seeing this lack in concentration from this chronic fatigue, it's another, I don't know how I would describe it, a violence of poverty, just this chronic stress that these students are facing. And the fact that families aren't able, especially if they're newly arrived immigrant or perhaps DACA recipients, they're not eligible for a lot of the current government programs. And there's a threat of eviction and ICE raids, and it's something that I've been thinking about almost since the pandemic first broke out. But just also tying that into the fact that at least here in the Bay Area, it's a very, very expensive place to live. And I know a lot of my teacher colleagues who, they still have a lot of financial burdens with themselves. I forget if a previous speaker said that they were a recent graduate, but it's just this idea of coming into the housing market with so much debt. And then on top of that, you're supposed to somehow find $3,000 for a deposit. And then the clear and present danger of us having to, as renters, having to cough up these thousands of dollars in a matter of months. It's just really kind of unsettling. But I guess I was wondering if anyone had thoughts, particularly Adam, on what has been the talk recently in, I believe it was Ithaca, New York, regarding a decision by the city to truly have a rent forgiveness, and any details on how that was actually achieved, if it was like a bottom-up pressure, or it had something to do with the relative affluence of the university town. Thank you.
You know, if we were trying to establish some type of like community guard, or like what we've read about in the past, you know, sort of tenant unions that come and gather and stop an eviction from happening while it's in process. I mean, I think with COVID, it gives like, it's just unconscionable right now to kick anyone out of their house. I think it'd be easier to build community support. But I guess, yeah, the question is like, that's solely the role of the sheriff, or, you know, if you're able to pressure your city council, could you get a moratorium on that? And if like individual landlords, if they're like acting out of control, I think, you know, it's a perfect time to start framing that, especially in the Bay Area, like the real estate industry, they're predators. They're straight, you know, they're looking forward to this, you know, what they see as a cycle for a bunch of people to lose their, you know, what you would call like, you mentioned that's how working people are able to hold on to whatever sort of generational wealth they might be able to pass on. You know, they're licking their chops, like looking at people who are about to lose their jobs, and those homes will come out cheap on the market for them. So, you know, back in 2006, in the first crisis, I worked, you know, straight out of high school, I worked in a real estate office at a clerk position. And it was like, inside, they just see it as numbers. It's like, they're all like, you know, they're no good. So in terms of like the class war perspective, I think you could really build community support. And the last thing, I just moved back into a neighborhood, you know, where I grew up, in a Bay Area city, and I was thinking of using the community emergency response trainings, which is just like, if an earthquake happens, you can reach out to your neighbors, check everyone's dogs, make sure everyone's okay. I was thinking of using that just to build community. So anyways.
Part of what I really think you did well was to sort of illuminate what the regular sort of excuses are for why things are bad in this society. And You know, in fact, that it makes a lot more sense when you're looking at the numbers and the patterns, that this is really a systemic problem. And I think, you know, the amount of crises for working people and young people in the society are just, you know, mounting. They're multiplying just on top of each other. And I think housing really, you know, it feels weird to say, like, I'm lucky, you know, to live where we live. And I have many coworkers who are commuting maybe an hour to work, back there and back, you know, just so that they can own a home. For me, I'll probably never own a home. But for a lot of people, that's something to achieve or something to work towards. And I think, you know, it just sort of poses that question of how important housing is to our lives, and what it means for people to have secure housing and not just rent their whole lives, but be able to own a home, and how important that is for people who grow up in this society. But yeah, I just, I think, you know, to think about in ways in which thank you, in the last period, people have really, you know, and it's since the 2008 crisis, just, you know, I forget the exact statistics, but in terms of different groupings and how racism and the racialized sort of special oppression that some working people suffer in this society, since 2008, it's really mind-blowing to hear some of that stuff. And of course, all of that comes in. So anyway, thank you.
Cool, thanks. Thanks, Adam. I'm also in Baltimore, so I appreciate the statistics that I can use in future conversations. And I really liked a lot of the ideas that were thrown out, particularly like who was talking about the community, like emergency response networks, like use any excuse that we can to connect with other people and to start those discussions. And I also really liked to comment about, you know, the fact that they were able to start organizing and trying to connect people around rent. And now that there's all of these anti-racist protests going on, now they're a group that can go to those as well. And so I think that's one way that we have to think about, you know, not only is it this entire system that we're trying to fight against that seems so large, but that any issue that we try to bring people together on and try to connect each other and develop, you know, relationships to people who eventually, you know, who knows how they can change in the future and how they can become opportunities to organize for other issues. I have a lot of questions about this because I'm also in a situation where I don't live in a large apartment building. You know, my landlord like lives in the apartment building. He has his mortgage still, and he's kind of like, my mortgage is going to be here longer than I will be, so I'm not sure what to do about this. And his bank agreed to pause the payments for the mortgage for this period, but it's unclear for him whether the interest rates are paused or you know, or what is he going to have to pay it all back. And I think we're all in such a situation where none of us know what's going to happen. Well, how much will we have to pay back in rent? How much will these small landlords have to pay back to the banks? But at the end of the day, it all comes back to the banks. I mean, they own everything, and any idea that we could do something individually to try to, you know, buy certain things differently, or, you know, it won't work. So we have to collectivize our struggles, and I appreciated your presentation. Thank you.
One of the reasons we don't know sort of what the policies will be towards, you know, back rent and so on, is because I don't think the ruling class knows either right now. The part of the reason that we saw the CARES Act pass and you had a moratorium on evictions is because the idea that they were going to carry out mass evictions of you know, the millions of people who got rapidly laid off would have been, I mean, A, they wouldn't have been able to do it, and B, it probably would have been like, you know, kicking a hornet's nest. And I think that threat still looms based upon whether people really maintain and continue and build and increase the level of organization that we have. It's certainly would be, you know, without any kind of pressure, we could see them, you know, go to their normal mode of operating and try and slowly carry out evictions and so on and so forth. But I think the idea that we should have to pay 1 penny for this crisis, you know, the idea that people who've lost their jobs are going to have to pay back rent or any rent, that's not going to change anytime soon. And that's what we have to say. It's unconscionable that anybody should have to be thrown out onto the streets because this system has thrown us out of work. And that kind of linking this kind of demand and these kinds of problems, these kinds of issues that people are facing to all the struggles, tying them together is going to be very important for us, you know, going forward, because we don't have one struggle in the streets and then another struggle in housing. We have the beginnings, hopefully, of the possibility of at least of one big common struggle against this system that, you know, just puts everybody's lives at risk.
You know, just listening to us, it reminds me of a lot of disturbing things I picked up, and probably everybody else has it. Many of you have too. One thing is that, you know, we don't know how long this economic disturbance is going to last. I mean, one thing we know is that the COVID isn't going to go anywhere, and people are just going to have to get used to living with it. And one of the consequences of that is a lot of things are not going to be the same. Is anybody going to be willing to go sit in a theater with a whole bunch of other people, or sit in a crowded restaurant and such like that? But then from one thing, and I discussing with my son, is the fact that you know, right now the federal government is not bailing out states and local governments, and that's going to be okay until the end of the budget year. But when the new budget year starts, it's about in 2021, they're going to be having a lot less money, and which means big cuts all over. Are we going to, you know, one thing I'm thinking, is this in some ways kind of intended, that after the 2008 crash, there was a massive wealth transfer, and as Adam said, was that a lot of it came from the poorest. That the next time there might, you know, be thrown into a situation where there's going to be another big wealth transfer, you know, from homeowners, and people are barely hanging on, small landlords and such. Is that what we're looking for next year, and what's going to be the consequence of all that?
So I've been thinking a lot about just how issues can be used in general to activate people, or I guess get people thinking about how there are larger systemic issues that we need to face in order to solve the individual problems that we face on a day-to-day basis. And mostly I've been into education and that side for the past 2 years, because I was a high school student and stuff. But now I've been, for the past year or so, I've been working with this quasi-governmental commission type thing on economic development in the city that I live in, which is Newark, New Jersey. So I've been thinking a lot about what my role in that, and thinking about how, because it's governmental or governmental associated, of course it's part of the system, and you can't change the system necessarily from within the system. I've been thinking about how that role and position, because we need people everywhere. We need people everywhere doing everything in order to actually get something changed, or actually to be there when the revolution pops off and stuff like that. What the role of a person in my position is, and also just the role of municipalities in general. So even if you have a good standing, or you're thinking about the betterment of people within your municipality, you're still limited in many ways, and you can't do a lot of things. So I've been thinking about that, and how basically what's been talked about a lot, how I can use my position that I'm in, along with the fact that all our struggles are kind of related, like renters, municipalities not having a lot of money, mom and pop landlords and stuff, how we can actually build solidarity between everybody to actually start fighting on the same page, how to manifest that, basically.
So I just want to return to something that Adam had said, and that's the fact that we can't solve the housing crisis without abolishing capitalism. I think right now we're in a prime moment to discuss what role we all have to play in working with people where we live, whether those are other organizers, working people, our own comrades, or folks that we meet out in the streets. The moment in which we find ourselves is frankly unlike anything I've ever seen. The conditions are such that people are beginning to really see something that we as socialists already recognize is state violence. Folks are forced to work under unsafe pandemic conditions. People are being threatened with losing their housing. Police are out in the streets in riot gear and throwing tear gas at protesters and continuing to murder people, especially people of color, with impunity. I certainly agree that there are ways in which we can make small incremental changes to make this sort of change in people's lives, but we're not going to fundamentally change the material conditions of folks currently experiencing or at risk of housing deprivation by demanding those kinds of things. I really think that this is the moment where we should be pushing an anti-capitalist agenda at all costs and pushing the conversation as far left as possible. There are calls to abolish the police right now, and with that come calls to abolish prisons, to provide housing for all, to engage in restorative practices, to address the traumas of capitalism, democratic community control, and ending laws that criminalize survival. All of these things are deeply connected, and we should be out in our communities talking to folks about these connections and why it is vital that we don't stop at reforms. And I think now the question we all have to ask ourselves is, how do we build institutions of working class autonomy and combine their struggles to challenge capital?
Right on. And I think in this movement, we can see things that have been invisible being made visible, and things that we believed were impossible possible. And, you know, what will be dictated by who has the power. If we have it, we'll be able to dictate it. If they have it, they will dictate it as they have in the past, and we will find ourselves worse off than we were before. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to trying to build with you all in whatever ways I can the power that will be necessary, the solidarity that will be necessary to create a new world in the rubble of the old.